Next, from Springfield, Mark DePue, the director of oral history at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, sits down with former Governor Jim Thompson as the two recall the close 1982 gubernatorial election, in which Governor Thompson defeated his Democrat opponent Adlai Stevenson by just 5,000 votes. This runs about 1 hour.
Welcome. My name is Mark DePue. I'm the Director of Oral History with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And today I have the distinct pleasure of having an opportunity to interview Governor Jim Thompson. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning, Mark.
You and I I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time. I don't know if you have or
well,
not.
Let's see how it goes. We'll find out.
We started this project doing a series of interviews with you some time ago, and we've already had 12 sessions, and we've gotten up to 1982. So today it's all about the election.
We got to move it along, Mark.
Yeah. We're going to go slow today, Governor. It's all about the election of 1982.
Wonderful.
Which there's some interesting stories, I would
yes,
hope.
Yes, there are.
The closest gubernatorial election in Illinois history, would that be correct?
Well, modern history. If you go back to the early 19th century when there were fewer voters, you might find a smaller margin. But in the real world, modern history, yes, the smallest, 5,024, except that 100,000 votes were stolen in Chicago. So the real margin is 105,074. But it's more fun to have the 5,074. So I've got the largest margin in state history and the smallest margin in state history.
The largest would have been the 76 election. Yeah. Well, that illustrates one point here to start with, that you had already won 2 gubernatorial elections.
Right.
And so this is your third that you decided to run in. I'm sure you made that decision in 81. Do you recall how you came to the conclusion that you needed to run a third time?
Well, I can't say that I needed to. I wanted to. Being governor of the state of Illinois, as Teddy Roosevelt told us long ago, the most American of all the states, is an extraordinary honor, an extraordinary privilege. And I thought we were doing good work for the people of Illinois, and I wanted to continue.
What I'd like to do here before we really get into the meat of the election, I didn't have any campaign ads for the 1982 election, but I wanted to show a short excerpt out of one of your campaign ads from 1976, one of those things that kind of introduces you to the Illinois public, if you will.
Sure.
In 4 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we learned a lot about government, good and bad. We learned 3 things that are important to this campaign. First, where does the money come from? The public has a right to know who supports a political candidate. The public has a right to know whether anybody owns the candidate, and nobody owns Jim Thompson. That's why we're disclosing every dollar we receive every day of the campaign. Campaign promises.
What's your name?
Too many candidates make promises that they can't keep. And so my only promise is one. I'm going to do the very best job I can if the people make me their governor. Finally, we learned that good government requires good people. People who care must make government their business. That's why I'm running for governor. That's why I'm asking every Illinoisan who wants to be proud of his government to get involved in my campaign.
Jim Thompson, for all of Illinois. Jim Thompson, for a governor and a government you can be proud of.
And they said, Jim Thompson's out on the corner.
That's right, he is.
I said, he's the first politician that I ever felt comfortable with.
Is that right? How
right.
come?
Because I think you're honest.
Well, thank you.
How about that?
So did you put her on the campaign staff after that ad?
No, we should have. You know, that out of 4 elections, that is probably my favorite ad. Looking at that, I had more hair then, I was younger then, I was thinner then, and we did this man on the street out in Oak Park, hoping to show a variety of people, all of whom came up to me I was just standing there, you know, and we were outside of a bank, and these people, passerbys, came and, you know, shook my hand and chatted, and we were there, gosh, most of the morning, I think. And this last lady, the one who was at the end of the commercial, she came up and said that, and I thought, oh my God, we've struck gold. I mean, she was just extraordinary and so natural, and what a great ending, right? So we had, or not we, I was just standing there, my staff had not gotten her consent after she talked to me to show her in a commercial. So for like a week after that, they went back and stood in front of the bank looking for her again to get her to consent to it. And I finally said, you know what? That's so great. We're going to do it anyway. And if she objects, she can sue us and we'll pay. And she never did. We never saw her again. But that remains my favorite campaign ad. It's great.
Well, let's jump back up to 1981, and let's just say that there's a different view of whether or not you're going to be running for election again, and I wanted to show this campaign, I should say a political cartoon, and it's got a picture of you, a sketch of you, of Walker, and of Stevenson. There it is. Big Jim, too long. Adlai, too dull. Dan, two-faced.
Who did that?
Chicago Sun-Times. So you probably know these cartoons
Yeah,
better than I do.
yeah.
We got some McNeely cartoons we wanted to show later on, but I thought that would be a good way to start this up. So,
That's
too long for you. What did Jane think about
you
your
know,
decision?
they didn't know what they were talking about. We did it again.
Yeah, you were just in the middle of this whole thing.
Exactly. I think this is the election where Jane claims that we hadn't talked about my running again, and she first heard about it when one of my cabinet members' wives called and said, "Oh, isn't this exciting? Jim is running again." She said, "I don't know anything about that." So when I got home that night, she said, "Well, I see you're running for governor again. It'd been nice to talk about it."
What did you think about your chances?
Well, you know, I thought we'd win. I knew the challenges were greater than any I'd ever faced because the state, like the country, was in a terrible recession, the worst since the Great Depression. And as we got nearer and nearer to Election Day, unemployment rates were going like this. Interest rates were going like this. State revenue was going like this. And it was an exceedingly challenging time. In addition, in the early part of his administration, Reagan, of course, got some of the blame for the recession, because that always happens. Whoever's in charge gets blamed. And so he was kind of unpopular. And so as the campaign later developed, you know, they were attacking me as Reagan's guy, Reagan's campaign manager, Reagan this and Reagan that, even though Reagan wasn't on the ballot. So it was probably the toughest time. And so I knew the election would be close. I knew it would be tough. And I decided to take the challenge and turn it around. So my campaign slogan that election was "A tough leader for tough times." And I said, you acknowledge it, seize hold of it, run on it, rather than letting it run you over.
Well, you've been mentioning some of the statistics, and I think it's appropriate that we take a harder look at the statistics. And this is January '82. That whole year is a bad year, but unemployment for the nation at 9.7%, for Illinois 11.3%.
Yeah.
So there's certainly something
Horrible.
Stevenson can talk about. Inflation rate of 8.4%, and this one I think would astound anybody today. A 30-year loan rate of 16%.
Yeah. Yep. No, it was incredible. And the closer we got to election, the worse it got. Almost as though, you know, a great economic figure in the sky said, okay, it's November 7th. We're going to make sure that's the worst day of the year. It probably came close.
Well, here's what Stevenson had to say, that he accused you of, quote, presiding over an economic decline that is unprecedented for Illinois and unmatched by any other state.
Well, I'm not sure that's completely accurate. But as I said, you know, we're one of 50 states. We're a microcosm of the nation. Look, in the real world, let's acknowledge that recessions are governed by big macroeconomic issues. I mean, I had nothing to do with the inflation rate sitting as governor of Illinois. I had nothing to do with the 16% interest rate. We're all victims of a recession, whether you're leading the state or you're a citizen who's trying to find a job or hang on to a job. And it's also governed by international trends. Where are our exports? You know, Illinois has been a big export state. Are they declining? Why are they declining? Is the rest of the country or is the rest of the world in recession, and therefore they're not buying as much from us? And that all traces back to a guy on the production line in Illinois. So, truth be told, while presidents and governors get credit for good economic times simply because they're in office, and so they get to claim or at least benefit from good economic times, the reverse is true. Presidents and governors get blame for bad economic times, even though, in a real sense, they have nothing to do with it. And so what you have to do, and what I tried to do, was to make sure that people were going to be protected by you as much as you could be, that you cared about their jobs, you cared about their suffering. You remember in the campaign for re-election of President Bush, when Clinton was his opponent, that's all Clinton talked about was the economy and how it was hurting everybody in that recession. And Bush could never get across the notion that he really cared about people and what they were going through, even though in that, what I would call white-collar recession in Bush's time, it was his political base that were suffering the most in that recession. White-collar jobs were disappearing. Guys who had worked and who were 50 years old all of a sudden were unemployed. Their kids were coming home from college. They couldn't get jobs. And Clinton, that's all he talked about. And it was his strength. And nothing else mattered in that election.
It's the economy, stupid.
It's the economy, stupid, and that was exactly right.
Well, let's get back to your election early in 1982. Obviously, one of the first things you have to do as a governor in any year is propose a budget. I think your budget that year was 14.1 billion dollars, which was a pretty austere budget.
It was.
What kind of things did you see that you had to do to be able to maintain something like a balanced budget, since the revenues were cratering, quite frankly?
Well, you had to cut spending. I mean, that's the only answer. Look, Illinois is not the federal government. We don't print money. You might wish you could print money in the midst of a recession, but you can't. Only the Congress can print money, it seems. So what do? You cut spending to match what you think your revenues are going to be. And that's what all states have to do. No state can print money. And when you turn to the budget, as tough as it is, you've got to first look at the places where you're spending the most money. You know, you could close a tiny Department of State government. You could close that 100%, and it wouldn't even begin to scratch the surface of a recessionary budget. So where do you look? Well, you look at education. Education is in budgets in the billions of dollars. You look at welfare in the billions of dollars. You go to the places in the budget where your spending is right at the top, and you take that down. Does that hurt people? Absolutely. Hurt school districts. School districts would have to rely more on local property taxes, which is never popular. And welfare advocates would start beating you on the head the minute you touch the welfare budget. But that's where the money is. You have no choice.
I know the budget that you proposed was $14.1 billion. I believe the budget that eventually got signed was in the neighborhood of $15 billion. So that's a fairly significant change.
Well, the legislature always increases the budget. I've never once seen, in my time anyway, a year in which the governor proposes X and the legislature comes in at minus X. You know, it's always plus X when the legislature gets through spending. And then you got to veto down to where you think the revenues will be, and then it goes back to the legislature, and they'll either agree with you and take down the spending to your level of veto, or they'll override you and put you in a deficit position.
Want to show this one other cartoon here from early in the campaign. This is a McNeely cartoon. He always had a way of lampooning everybody in the process.
Absolutely.
But, it's obviously showing you're going to be saddled is the wrong word since the horse is riding you on this thing. But that's quite a burden to bear, is trying to pull the economy over the finish line
right.
and actually win this election.
Yeah.
Is that the way you felt about it?
Yeah, when you get up in the morning and you read the headlines again, and all the economic factors are going the wrong way, right? And the election's getting closer and closer. Sure. That was a challenge. But I mean, there were ways to mitigate it. First of all, I had won 2 elections, and I was a known commodity in the state. Senator Stevenson had been in the Senate and had been a state representative, but nobody really knew what he was going to do or say and how he would be as a governor. And I had been popular in 2 prior elections, so you got a base. Apart from the horrible economic time, nobody was really mad at me that I could tell. So yeah, I felt like I was carrying that economy on my back as I approached the election, but I took some steps to show what I thought. I mean, I can recall going out to a union hall where I think it was the printers union, and the plain fact was that 50% of their members were unemployed. 50%. And I talked to the union members in the union hall, and afterwards they lined up to come talk to me. And some of them asked for autographs, and I thought, wow, here's a guy, he's without a job in the midst of this horrible recession. He wants my autograph. And then they started handing me $5 or $10 for my campaign. And I thought, this is amazing that these guys without financial resources, scrimping at home, I'm sure, on unemployment insurance or union funds to feed their family, are willing to pull money out of their pocket and give it to me for my campaign, $5 or $10. I mean, it's you get a feeling of great humility and great gratitude then, and you just resolve to fight even harder for these people, and you're signing their union cards, you know. So I made it pretty clear, I think, that I would do everything in my power as a governor to help mitigate the disastrous economy in Illinois, and that was my campaign ethos and my campaign slogan. We were fighting.
I wonder if you can take a couple minutes and tell me about the campaign team. This is the third campaign you're running. I would assume you have some old hands, some experienced people helping.
Yeah, Bob Schalander was the campaign manager, and of course all of my staff working both on the governmental side and the political side were working as hard as they could, as hard as I was, because they understood the dangers and the difficulties of this campaign. And then near the end, Phil O'Connor, who had been in several positions that I had appointed him to, came in and worked with Bob to end the campaign. And we took an old Pat Quinn trick and used it ourselves, and that is to hold a press conference in Chicago on Sunday morning when nothing else was going on, right? And so reporters had to show up because there was literally nothing else in town. And so you'd get 3 or 4 television cameras, you get print reporters, and whatever you announced that day, didn't make any difference what it was going to be in the headlines on Monday morning. All right? And now Pat Quinn, during the course of his career, made that a famous tactic of his. Now, his Sunday morning press conferences were more like attacks, which he did for 30 years before he got to be governor. And mine was announcing things that I thought would help the people of Illinois, and maybe disagreeing with Stevenson on some issue. But it worked.
You mentioned Phil O'Connor coming in. I read reports that he came on board with the campaign about July time frame.
Yeah.
And that he came on board because there were some troubles in the campaign.
No, I don't think I would call it troubles in the campaign. I think I would call it troubles in the election. It was really tough, and we wanted every voice we could have in the campaign apparatus, every idea that we could consider to push us over the line. And Phil was a new, different voice, and he was smart, and he had political instincts, you know, on what would work and what wouldn't. So adding him to the team in the middle of the summer for the November election was, I think, the right thing to do.
Was David Gilbert still doing the press secretary work?
Oh,
for you?
sure, yeah. Gilbert was there for a long, long time. He was my first hire in my campaign for governor.
In the '76 campaign.
Yes. Dave had been the transportation editor of the Chicago Tribune, and I don't know how we got together, but I hired him to be the press secretary. He was the first person I hired in the campaign, and he stayed for years and years, and is still a great friend today. Smart guy, worked hard. We really were a simpatico team, you know. So, yeah, his voice was in there too.
And I got to tell you, Governor, Dave Gilbert has, I think, the best Jim Thompson stories I've
I'm
heard.
sure he does. He was everywhere, both in campaigns and in my administration. So he's seen it all.
How about the advertising firm? Did you stay with Bailey Deardorff?
I did. I had Bailey Deardorff the whole time, all 4 elections.
Is that an Illinois firm, or is that?
No, that's a Washington-based firm. They were regarded as the best political / advertising firm in the country, and I think they were. Their success records in other elections certainly demonstrated that. They worked predominantly with Republican gubernatorial candidates. That's their forte. And in the first campaign, '76, they wrote all the campaign ads. Then I started getting adventurous and started to change them just before we went on camera, right? So they had to take the cardboard things that we were all reading off and scratch out and write in corrections that I had done. And then I think by the 3rd campaign, I was writing my own campaign ads.
You personally were writing?
I was, yes. Yes, and they'd hover over and edit, and so we were a good team. We really were.
How about the fundraising side? Now, by this time, you're experienced at the fundraising. Who was heading up that effort for you?
A team of guys that were very successful people on the north shore of Chicago. Campaign financial chairman was my later partner at the law firm Winston and Strawn. He was the chairman, Tommy Reynolds. And there were, maybe 10, 15 business guys who called themselves the Breakfast Club, because they used to meet at the Chicago Club and have breakfast and plan the fundraising. And then we had staff people who would plan the actual fundraising dinners and the fundraising receptions and the phone calls and all of the solicitation that's part of a political campaign. So you had the business types over here and the actual people doing the work of putting together an event over here, and it worked very well.
Now, I know that the primary was in March. As I recall, you didn't have an opponent.
Right.
And I would assume by the time the primary is happening, you pretty much know there's going to be Stevenson on the Democrat side.
Correct.
Tell me about then selecting your lieutenant governor, because at the beginning of the campaign, you didn't have a lieutenant governor at all.
Right. So there were a fair number of people who wanted to be the lieutenant governor candidate.
Even with the reputation the job has?
Yeah, sure. You know, everybody makes of the office what they want it to be. You're not bound by the limitations of what the Constitution says your duties are, or what the statutes say your duties are. If you have a good partnership with the governor, you can do pretty much anything you want. Anything the governor will let you do. And I looked at all the potential candidates, legislators, people outside my staff, and I thought, well, you know, I ought to pick somebody who has got a political base that's a little different than mine. And so I finally picked George Ryan, who had been Speaker of the House, who was more conservative in his views than I was, but was a very hard worker and had friends around the state. So I thought George would have been a very good guy to what we in the old days called balancing the ticket. Now it doesn't seem to be the fashion anymore in politics. The recent election, Rauner's election, picking Evelyn Sanguetti, she didn't have any political base. She held local political office. But she was a woman, and I think he wanted a woman as lieutenant governor candidate. So there are all different kinds of things. Blagojevich and Quinn, you know, that's a kind of an odd combination. So I was looking for somebody who would shore me up on the conservative Republican side, even though I didn't think that we were going to be that involved in social issues, because the economy was the overriding issue of the campaign.
If you had lost the election, would Ryan had been able to hold his seat in the legislature? I would assume not.
Not.
Did you see?
Because House members have to run every 2 years, and he couldn't run for a House member and lieutenant governor at the same time.
Did you see some obvious leadership that would assume that role in the House on the Republican side?
Well, if I lost the governor's race, I'm not sure I would have been.
No, if you won the governor's race.
Oh, won the governor's race.
He's going to be out of the speaker position anyway.
Well, look, one of the first things you learn is that a governor doesn't mess in the legislature's affairs, and you hope vice versa. And it would have been a mistake for me, even though some governors have done it, and you could do it. But I think it's a mistake for a governor to try and influence the selection of House or Senate leaders.
In other words, that wasn't something you were concerned about going into.
No. There would have been plenty of candidates lining up. I didn't think there would be a dearth of candidates.
And there certainly was.
Right.
Okay, going into the election, once you get past the primary, you get into the general election season, and that's obviously about the issues. We've already talked about the main issue being the economy, but what else was out there that was being discussed?
You know what? I don't remember much else about what was being discussed. Well, irritating things. The Equal Rights Amendment was out there, and it was one of the most bedeviling issues that a governor could face. I was for the Equal Rights Amendment from the beginning, from 1976. No question about it. I thought this is a matter of simple justice. Even though as a lawyer, I thought that that kind of protection was already in the Constitution under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause of the Illinois Constitution, and that we didn't really need the Equal Rights Amendment to ensure that women would have equal rights. But it was an issue that a lot of women took hold of, and I think not so much, well, yes, they said they wanted to make sure that women were equal, but I think it was more of a branding issue, it was like the symbol of women fighting for more than equal protection from the government. They wanted equal protection in the workplace. They wanted to have an opportunity to be hired as well as men. They wanted an opportunity to be paid as well as men. None of that had anything to do with the ERA, because the ERA would have protected only against government prejudice. But it was a way for women to enlarge their presence on the political and social and economic sides. And so it became very important to a lot of people. And yet, in the constitutional scheme of things, governors didn't have anything to do with it. It was simply a legislative matter. Governors didn't sign it. It didn't go across their desks. And yet, because you were sitting in the governor's chair, people just assumed you could get this done, right?
Well, let's put the ER8 fight into some context here, because it's a very interesting discussion. You and I have talked about this a couple times before. The battle started in 1972 when it was passed in the U.S. Congress.
Right.
And every year from 1972 all the way up to 1982, it had been a interesting battle. Would that be the way to put it?
Yeah,
in Illinois?
That in 1982 it got really
because that's the last year.
Front and center.
That's the
right?
last year.
And so there were terrific arguments and controversies in the House and in the Senate. And of course it extended to the governor because, okay, he's the guy in charge. He ought to be able to get this thing done, right? And yet I'm faced with a Democratic legislature. So I was assumed to be able to tell a Democratic legislature to pass the Equal Rights Amendment And in addition, it was a very conservative legislature. And, you know, a lot of Democrats from Chicago in 1982, not the same as the Democrats from Chicago today. Democrats from Chicago today would have no difficulty voting for the Equal Rights Amendment, right? But back in 82, the politics of Chicago were much more an ethnic politics. And in some of the ethnic cultures of Chicago back in the 80s, the culture within the family was much different than it is today. I would have a devil of a time trying to persuade Italian legislators from Chicago to vote for this. Why? Because their wives and mothers were opposed to it. They were conservative. They came from a conservative culture. And they didn't want it. And so when the representative came down to Springfield and was faced with a vote, back home, his mother and his wife were on the phone and saying, And those politics wouldn't exist today, but they existed back then. And I can remember doing everything in the world to try and get this thing passed, even though the Democrats, supposedly the liberals, a lot of them were opposed to it. I can remember Phil Rock, my friend, great legislative leader. He and I were great partners the whole time I was governor, and he was the president of the Senate. But he was very clever. He wasn't going to put his conservative Democratic senators out on the line for ERA. He didn't want them to get the blame. He didn't want the Democratic Party to get the blame for the failure to pass it. So they held it back and held it back and held it back. And it didn't pass. And so with every rebuff on the political side, the campaign for it got tougher and louder. And it was not an easy summer and fall in that election, 1982.
Well, the clock ran out in June of 1982. Once
Yeah.
it got past June of 82, it
Right.
was no longer going to pass at all.
Yeah, but that didn't mean that people who were for it were going to suddenly drop everything and not try to punish the people who were there when it didn't get passed, right? Including me. So, but before that, before the June, I mean, every place I went in the state of Illinois, there'd be a group of women greeting me, chanting. I'd get off the airplane, there were a group of women. Big Jim, remember, we vote in November. And of course, my lieutenant governor candidate, George Ryan, he was against the ERA. So, you know, I got tagged with that. And in the meantime, the Democrats in both the House and the Senate were very smart. They were content to sit there, not vote for it, not pass it, but to let me take the blame, even though under the Constitution I had nothing to do with it. I mean, so it was a devil of an issue, really. I mean, I ended up with the wife of one of my cabinet members joining a group picketing the mansion. Now, doesn't get much closer to home than that, right? And here's my daughter, who is, what, 4 years old, was out on the mansion grounds, and she saw these picketers marching around the whole block, and she walked over to the fence and said to them, "You get out of here. You're bothering my daddy." That's how close to home it got.
Well, I want to remind you of a couple of the most incendiary incidents that have happened in that particular year. One of the things leading up to that June deadline, there was a hunger strike that some of the women started, and then a couple weeks before the deadline, a group of women, the grassroots group of second-class citizens, decided they were going to chain themselves to the railing outside the Senate chamber. Recall that incident?
Yes.
Any reflections on it? Well, let me throw in one more, and then I'll let you comment on both of them. When it finally went down to defeat, it went down with a whimper because, as you mentioned, Senator Rock saw that he didn't even have the votes in the committee hearing, so it
Right.
never even made it out of the committee in the
Correct.
Senate, and that was the end of it.
Right.
And after that occurred, the same group of women got some pig's blood, put it in ketchup bottles, and went outside on the floor of the Capitol building and were spraying your name and I think George Ryan's name on the floor of the Capitol in pig's blood.
Well, and they were throwing blood on the doors of my office. But before that time, as the campaign of some of the fringe group in support of the amendment got more, I won't say violent, but tougher, rowdier, then the tables turned. When they threw blood on my door, glass doors in my office, public opinion in Illinois started to shift, and that lifted some of the political onus on me. You know, in politics, when you go too far, usually the issue reverses, and people didn't like the idea of throwing blood on the door of the governor's office or chaining yourself to the rails in the Capitol building. And from that day forward, we could tell by polls and by what we were hearing on the street that the tide had turned, and it was not going to be a significant issue in November because they went too far.
Okay. Going back then to some of the other issues, and I'll just do a reminder here of some of the things I saw in the newspaper clippings. The new federalism, Reagan's new federalism, and that was something that was discussed early in the campaign, not so much later on.
Well, Reagan's new federalism, I thought, was finally the culmination of a movement that had begun somewhat earlier, even back to Nixon's time. For years and years and years, states were like a litter of piglets feeding off the mother. Okay? Everybody in politics assumes that it was the obligation of the federal government to transfer its wealth in one way or another to the states, whether it was in state grants, transfers of funds for various programs that the federal government thought the states ought to be doing. And the states, of course, were the beneficiaries of all this largesse, and they thought it was wonderful, and they kept thinking of ways to get more, right? And then it became apparent, I think, to a lot of us that this was not a situation where the federal government's money had no end. You know, the federal government was having revenue problems like the states were. I can remember back in Nixon's time visiting the White House when he announced, with other governors, announced that they were going to have revenue sharing. You know, there was a program back at that time where X amount of dollars from the federal budget went to the states for whatever they wanted, revenue sharing. And he announced in this meeting they were going to end it. And all the governors came out of the White House, were standing on the lawn in the driveway, and press was running around interviewing us. And a reporter came up to me and said, "Well, don't you think this is terrible that the president is going to end revenue sharing with the states?" I said, "They don't have any revenue to share. And if they don't have any revenue to share, of course it's going to end. And states are going to have to become more independent and self-sufficient, raise their own revenue." And I think that feeling just got sort of a momentum to it that as the political process went along, and everybody realized that there would have to be new principles that govern the relationship between the federal government and the states. It was not going to be a matter anymore of the 8 piglets sucking on the sow, you know. It's just, those days were over.
Well, speaking of issues, and you mentioned revenues, finding different revenue sources to try to prevent the state from going into debt too much is going to be part of it. Now, up to this point, from what I have seen, you didn't have any tax increases at all, but I know
Right.
that there was discussion by you early on about the possibility of raising liquor taxes, and later in the campaign, a possibility of raising gas taxes to support the infrastructure.
Well, there was some discussion of that in the 82 period, but most of that came after the election of the 83 period, when I made a significant attempt to increase gas taxes, not for the purposes of supporting the state budget, but for the purpose for which they were intended, fixing the roads and building new ones. You know, the gas tax is such a trap. It really is. I mean, you know, first of all, people at the gas pump don't know what percentage of what they're paying per gallon is the cost of the gas, what percentage is the gas tax, what percentage is the local tax. But politicians just get afraid of it. And so the years go by without a gas tax. And what's happening is that you've got more and more cars on the road. The roads are being torn up at a greater rate. The mileage for cars improves every year. So people buy less gas. So you get less tax to try and keep up a growing road system. And at some point,
In a time of high inflation.
in a time of high inflation, yeah. So, so every once in a while, you know, governors will raise their voice. Hey, we've got to increase the gas tax, and then of course all the political criticism descends, and the editorials in the newspaper, and I mean, you would have thought you were taking away the firstborn child. Honestly, it's just. But you got to do it. You got to do it. But it was not for the purpose of sustaining the state budget.
Now, I want to ask you, at this early stage of the campaign, into the early summertime frame, what was the opinion that you and the campaign have had about your opponent, Adlai Stevenson III, and how did you want to, well, this is a strategy question, how did you want to portray him?
Well, I think the question makes it sound bigger than it was. Look, the dominant theme of the campaign was terrible economic times and what I was doing to try and help people in these terrible economic times. Adlai was irrelevant to that, okay? Because he wasn't in a position to help anybody. He could talk about what he would do, but he wasn't in charge. So, and I'd always thought that Stevenson Stevenson's personality didn't quite fit what people would expect of a governor. He always seemed to be above it all. You never saw Adlai campaign in the way that I campaigned, up close and personal. And I thought that his campaign strategy of attack, attack, attack wasn't going to be of much comfort to voters. And I think it was in this campaign that we released the only what I would call negative attack on Stevenson, even though all it did was quote him. He left the Senate, said he was bored, And I'm thinking, how can you be bored in the United States Senate? Left the Senate, said he was bored. We looked at his record. He passed 2 pieces of legislation at the time he was there, one of which benefited him, a tax bill, and came home to run for governor. I thought, well, there's the makings of a commercial, you would think, and so that's what we said in the commercial. He was a United States Senator. He passed 2 bills, one of which benefited him, and then he announced he was bored and came home. And we thought, well, that's not going to advance a gubernatorial campaign very far, I wouldn't think. And so I don't think we put a lot of focus on Adlai as a candidate or a campaigner. All of our focus was on me as a governor and a candidate. So I think that was basically the root of the business.